Hello, everybody. We are in Unit 9, our final unit for AP US History for this year. And today we're going to be talking about the Conservative Revolution and about the presidency of Ronald Reagan. Now, you're going to see when we talk about presidents of Unit 9 and when we're in Unit 9, that a lot of it is just going to be kind of talking about the facts of their presidency and that kind of stuff. And the reason behind that is because we are so close to historically in these periods. I think that a lot of times we can't really evaluate a lot of the policies. And plus, a lot of what you are going to see in history books concerning Reagan and to the present is often going to be have quite a good amount of bias to it. So when we're talking about presidents through this era, I just know that we're not going to do a whole lot of evaluation in them of their programs just because we are so close to that period and because of the danger of just bias kind of sneaking into that in general. So just know that when we talk about Reagan, the two Bushes, Clinton, and Obama, that's how we are going to kind of approach them in this unit. So let's talk about this conservative revolution. We had talked about in 1964 and how that kind of marked the beginning of a shift to more of a conservative America with the presidency of Barry, or with the candidacy of Barry Goldwater. And a lot of that had been birthed out of the protest movements that we saw in the 60s and 70s, which caused a lot of social stress and fragmentation. You have that combined with the slowing economy of the 70s and the late 60s and the declining standard of living. And that left a lot of Americans very bitter. And really, we had kind of been in this liberal consensus since the 1930s with the New Deal. And you're going to start to see that liberal consensus finally starting to break down a little bit. So we already talked about 1964, the presidency of Barry Goldwater, but you're also going to see that during this era that you're going to have some more kind of conservative stars rise and bring more attention to conservative causes during this time. So you would have William Buckley Jr. He's pictured right there at the top. He would write the National Review, which is again part of like a conservative think tank. They still do a lot of writing today. And you would have the free market economist Milton Friedman, who would have an effect on how people viewed government spending and tax policy as well. Now, you're going to see that this shift to a more conservative United States is kind of led by a coalition of political and economic conservatives, just like we talked about with Buckley and Friedman here, religious fundamentalists, and political action committees. And these new conservatives are going to oppose a lot of these classically liberal policies from like the 30s, like New Deal liberalism. Gun control is going to be a big one. Feminism, welfare, affirmative action, the sexual revolution, and drug use. These are all going to be things that they are going to oppose, and you're going to see more Americans start to oppose those during this period as well. So I have a scene here for you to watch from Back to the Future when Marty goes back to 1955 and talks a little bit about Ronald Reagan. So I encourage you to check that out. Again, I know I've told y'all before, but that's one of my favorite movies. So leading issues, what were going to be the leading issues for conservatives? One, the taxpayers' revolt. We kind of talked about that. I think it was last class that we talked about that. The idea that a lot of people got moved into a higher tax bracket because of inflation, and they were not very happy with that. So conservatives are going to promote Arthur Laffer's theory, the Laffer curve, that tax cuts would increase government revenues. Again, that was the big push, and that's what he saw. He said, hey, if you cut taxes, that puts more hands in taxpayer money in the hands of taxpayers, and then they will spend more and help promote the economy and increase government revenues because people are buying more tax money. So you'd actually see Congressman Jack Kemp and William Roth. They would propose legislation to reduce federal taxes by 30%. Also, during this time, you are going to see the evangelical movement. You're going to start to see kind of a religious revival. A lot of these guys go on TV. They have TV shows and got a ton of viewers during this time. And some examples, Pat Robertson, Oral Roberts, and Jim Baker go on there. And one of the big things that they would emphasize is the moral decay of the United States and how we really needed to do something about that. Here locally, but he did have a nationwide presence. You'd have Pastor Jerry Falwell. And one of the things, to this point in history, you're going to see a lot of people that were conservatives, or at least evangelicals, didn't really believe very much in participating in politics. They didn't really see the purpose or the use of it. And Jerry Falwell was going to change that view by founding the Moral Majority. And the whole purpose of that was, again, to promote candidates that promoted evangelical values across the country. So they would help finance, Moral Majority would help finance campaigns to unseat liberal members of Congress throughout the country. And he would also, Falwell would emphasize the importance of Christians being involved politically. All right, more leading issues for conservatives. Elimination of racial preferences. And again, we kind of talked about how busing was an issue. And you're going to see that a lot of conservatives are upset with what it seemed like that racial preferences across the country, like having quotas and that kind of thing, had upset a lot of people. I don't think as much as it's people saying, hey, we don't want certain groups of people in colleges, but people didn't like the idea that somebody was getting special treatment based on their race or color. And you're going to see that, again, best shown in the Supreme Court case, Regents of the University of California versus Bach. And in this, the Supreme Court would rule that while race could be considered when talking about admission to college, that school, the University of California, had created racial quotas, which they said those were unconstitutional. And conservatives would use this decision saying, hey, we should get rid of all preferences based on race and ethnicity. Another thing, regulation of business. Or deregulation of business. Conservatives would push to deregulate business. Basically, they would say that regulations had stifled business within the country and prevented a lot of things from getting done. Now, you're going to see a couple big organizations that would come out during this time that are still around today, the Heritage Foundation and the Cato Institute. They were considered these conservative think tanks. And again, they would promote free market ideas along with a lot of other ideas of the conservative revolution here. So that brings us to the election of 1980. You have Jimmy Carter versus Ronald Reagan. We talked about how unpopular Jimmy Carter was at this time, how his approval rate was down in the 20%. Reagan had tried in 1976. Remember, he had ran against Gerald Ford and almost was able to beat Gerald Ford, who was the sitting president at the time. Now, Ronald Reagan, again, formerly an actor, he was considered a very, very likable guy to most Americans and very sensible by most Americans. And his whole platform was based on optimism and patriotism. He said, this is the greatest country in the world. We have the talent. We have the drive. All we need is the leadership. And really his big tagline of his campaign would be, are you better off today than you were 4 years ago? Another thing that he would point out is what he called the misery index of 28. And that was the rate of inflation added to the rate of unemployment, and he would bring that up frequently. And again, it's kind of hard. I can't say that, it shouldn't be overstated, but really Reagan was a very, very likable guy. Even people that were Democrats who were very much against his policies found him a very likable guy. And I think that's why you're going to see him be such a successful president in that sense, because people, even though you disagreed with him, you still liked him as a guy. You can see there the election map, and Reagan would easily win. Again, can't say it enough how disliked Jimmy Carter was, because a lot of people disliked him and his policies. So they're going to call this a political realignment of 1960. I think the last time we talked about a political realignment was 1968. You're going to see of the core of the GOP would remain the white Protestants who opposed government activism and were anti-crime, anti-communism. You would also have a new coalition, what would be known as Reagan Democrats. These were formerly Democratic Southern whites, Rust Belt workers, Catholic blue-collar workers, young voters, and suburbia. And it's interesting if you look at historical trends that some of these people that were Reagan Democrats are actually going to be the people that vote for Trump in his first election, too, that kind of flip over to him for that election. You'd also have the religious right with the Moral Majority, who had registered over 2 million voters. You'll see the Republican platform in general just becomes more conservative. And then remember, we talked about the Moral Majority and how they financed these candidates to beat more liberal members of Congress. 11 Democratic senators are going to be defeated in 1980, which would give Republicans control of the Senate for the first time since 1954. And you'd also have 33 House seats gained by the GOP. So you may have heard the phrase recently, the red wave. really 1980 election was kind of a red wave with the dominance of Republicans in the polls in that election. So beginning of Reagan's presidency, you're going to see he gives in his first inaugural speech, he'll say that in this present crisis, government is not the solution to our problem, government is the problem. And again, that fits in line perfectly with his small government philosophy. You would see also, we talked about the Iranian hostage crisis, that on the day of Reagan's inauguration, that the Iranians would release the American hostages. So you can say that's kind of a smack in the face to Jimmy Carter there, who had worked a long time to try to get these hostages released. And then on the day that Reagan is sworn into office, they would be released. Now, one of the big events of the beginning of Reagan's presidency, 2 months in, Reagan, there would be an assassination attempt on his life. He would be shot during that time. He would get shot in the lungs. Or in the lung. He wouldn't realize that it was that as bad as it was. They got him in the car. As you see, if you watch this video here, they actually got him in the car. And he thought he had some cracked ribs because he had been, kind of pushed violently into the car to protect him. And they were going to take him back to the White House. And then he started coughing up blood, and they realized how serious that it actually was. And one of the interesting stories to come out of that is actually when they got him to the ER and they're about to take him in to the operating room, he was on the operating room table, and he said to the doctors, "I hope you are all Republicans." And one of the doctors replied to him and said, "Today, Mr. President, we are all Republicans." He would emerge from that. Again, it'd take him a little bit of time to heal from that, but he would emerge from this assassination attempt as a very, very popular leader now, after having survived this. In one of his first speeches back to Congress after recovering from this assassination attempt, he would pledge to lower taxes, reduce government spending on welfare, build up the military, and create a more conservative federal court. And you're going to see in a lot of ways that people, because of this assassination attempt and because of how popular of an individual that he was, that is going to lead Congress to really kind of work with him in achieving his goals. And one of the big things you'll hear about with Reagan is Reaganomics. And that's what they called his theories, the supply side economic theory, as it is called. And Reagan, again, argued for tax cuts and reduced government spending, which he said would increase investment by the private sector because they would have more money to put into the economy. And he said that this would lead to increased production, jobs, and prosperity. And this was a direct contrast with Keynesian theory that we had talked about, which said that you do deficit spending, more government spending to help promote the economy. Now, you will see critics of Reaganomics would call this trickle-down economics and compare it to the 1920s where the wealthy prospered by saying, hey, you're giving a lot of money to the wealthy and hoping that money trickles down to the lower and the middle classes. Now, he did work with Congress. He got the Economic Recovery Act of 1981 passed, which decreased personal income tax by 25% over 3 years. It also made cuts to the corporate income tax, capital gains tax, and gift and inheritance tax. Reagan would also work for some spending cuts and regulatory cutbacks, again, going in line with his philosophy. He cut the budgets of federal agencies by 12%, and he started to transfer some responsibilities back to states. One of the big ways that he would do that is through block grants. We mentioned those during Nixon's administration. Basically, a block grant, though, is where the federal government gives a state a portion of money and says, hey, use this on healthcare or whatever it might be. So instead of the federal government administering the program, that puts it in the hands of the states to do that. Now, again, more deregulation. Again, Reagan promised to get government off the backs of the people, and he would reduce federal regulations on business and industry, including the auto industry and the savings and loan institutions. You'd also see that federal lands were opened up for increased coal and timber production and offshore waters for oil drilling. And again, this doesn't necessarily mean he's anti-environment. Think about Teddy Roosevelt's view on the environment and the idea that we could responsibly use federal lands for certain things. And that's kind of the philosophy that Ronald Reagan had with this. Reagan would also take a very tough stance towards labor unions during this time. You'd have federal air controllers go on strike during this time, and he would respond by having them fired for violating their contract. And again, the importance of this, if you think about them going on strike, it would shut down air travel. And so he took a very tough stance to them. Again, going back kind of similar to the view of Calvin Coolidge, who we talked about in the 1920s when the police would strike in Boston. And Calvin Coolidge's response was to fire them all, saying that they could not endanger public safety. Now, in 1982, you would see the United States would suffer the worst recession since the 1930s. You'd have a lot of banks fail and unemployment would reach 11%. You would see, though, as Reaganomics and some of the policies passed earlier in Reagan's presidency, as they took hold and also oil prices fell, because remember, we'd still had the oil crisis, the two of the 70s. You'd see the economy would rebound and you would enter a long period of recovery. So when we're looking at the actual budget itself, you're going to see that one of the things with tax cuts, and this has happened throughout history, is that when you do tax cuts, that generally that's going to lead to more deficits because, again, that's taking money away that the government would normally spend, and the government tends to still spend that money, so that means they're going more in debt. So you're going to have these large tax cuts that he would do, as well as large increases in military spending, would lead to deficits of more than $200 billion a year, and you'd actually see the national debt triple during Ronald Reagan's term. If you look at that chart there, it actually shows the deficits, and you can see there, like the peak of it, let's see, in 1982-ish or so during Reagan's presidency there. You'd also see the U.S. trade deficit would reach $1 million due to consumption of foreign-made and luxury and consumer goods. Again, that's not really the fault of Reagan. You're going to see a shift to people, again, buying more overseas products from Japan, China, and Germany, and those places. People were buying more of those. And again, coming back to the Future, when Marty goes to the past, and they were talking about, I think, a piece on the car that was broken, and Doc looks at the piece of the car, and I think it says "Made in Japan," and he looks at it and he goes, "Oh, that explains your problem. It's made in Japan." Again, he's thinking in 1955 mindset. And Marty, coming from 1985, he says, "What are you talking about? All the best stuff comes from Japan." So again, showing that kind of mentality there in the mid-'80s and a shift in thought. Now, Congress during this time would pass the Balanced Budget Act to provide across-the-board spending cuts because people were worried about the budget deficit, and Congress would be able to reduce the deficit by $66 billion from 86 to 88. Again, because of the level of federal spending, $66 billion, kind of just a drop in the bucket as to how much spending that there was. Now, as far as Reagan and social issues, you're going to see one of the big ways Reagan would have the biggest effect on social issues is by appointing conservative justices to the Supreme Court. He would also appoint the first female Supreme Court justice, Sandra Day O'Connor. You can see the list there. As of, I think, Anthony Kennedy retired during Trump's administration. So now all of those Supreme Court justices are off the court. You would also see the court would back affirmative action in hiring and promotions, and would limit Roe versus Wade by allowing states to impose certain restrictions on abortion. Now that brings us to the election of 1984, and you're going to see Ronald Reagan's big campaign theme during this is "It's Morning in America," and this would have him facing off against Walter Mondale. Mondale would choose Geraldine Ferrero as his running mate, and she would be the first woman to run on the presidential ticket of a major party. And despite his attempts, again, Mondale's really going to try to appeal to the old New Deal coalition and women. His message really did fall flat. A lot of people didn't find him a very inspiring guy at all. Jesse Jackson would also become the first African-American to run for president. He would run under the National Rainbow Coalition. You might be familiar with Jesse Jackson. He is still around today. But as far as the results of this election go, if you look at the election map there, the only state that Walter Mondale would carry would be Minnesota, which was his home state. So again, I think that again attests to the popularity of Reagan and the popularity of a lot of the things that he was trying to accomplish during his time. Now, another area that Reagan is going to take a very tough stance on is on communism, and it's called Reagan's hard line on communism. Reagan would call the Soviet communists the evil empire and the focus of evil within the modern world. So he's going to take this very, very tough stance, but you're going to see going into his second term, that Reagan is going to show that he is flexible enough to work with the Soviet Union during this time. Now, one of the big ways that Reagan is going to put pressure on the Soviet Union is by increasing military spending. He believed by increasing military spending, that would put pressure on the Soviet Union to do the same. And the thing with the Soviet Union is that economically, they were in such a poor place that it was going to hurt them a lot more to spend a lot more on the military. So Reagan would spend billions on new weapon systems to expand the U.S. Navy and on the Strategic Defense Initiative. This initiative became known as Star Wars, which was a plan which was a plan for building these high-tech laser systems in space, basically that it could destroy enemy missiles before they could hit the U.S. Now, a lot of people looked at the Star Wars plan and said, is this actually possible given the technology that we have now? I've read that some people believe that Reagan knew that it wasn't possible, but again, that it was yet another way to put pressure on the Soviet Union. Again, I don't know if that's what his goal was during this time, but you're going to see he really does step up everything that he can to put pressure on the Soviet Union. Now, when you talk about Reagan's Central American foreign policy, it's going to be a little bit different here. You're going to see in Nicaragua that the U.S. would provide military aid to the Nicaraguan Contras and their efforts to overthrow the communist Sandinistas there. You would see that by 1985, though, that Congress would actually prohibit further aid to the Contras there in Nicaragua. Again, some people looked at this and said, well, hey, we don't want another Vietnam situation on our hands here. In El Salvador, the U.S. would send $5 billion in aid there to help support the government against a coalition of leftist guerrillas there. And then in Grenada, you're going to see that a coup there would lead to the establishment of a pro-Cuban regime. And Reagan would order a small force of Marines to invade and prevent the establishment of a communist military base, which would be Grenada and their government there. That invasion would be successful in reestablishing a pro-U.S. non-communist government. Now, the biggest scandal of Reagan's administration is going to be the Iran-Contra affair. Now, Iraq and Iran had been fighting in a bloody war since the 1980s. Even today, those two countries do not like each other. They're both Muslim countries, but still they do not like each other. So Reagan aides created a plan to sell U.S. anti-tank and anti-aircraft missiles to Iran's government in exchange for the release of 7 American hostages in Lebanon. And again, this is separate from those other hostages that we had talked about earlier on. And basically the way that this plan worked is guns would be shipped by Israel to Iran. The U.S. would resupply Israel, and Israel would pay the U.S. for the weapons. Now, where this gets very, very dicey here is that in 1985, Lieutenant Colonel Oliver North of the National Security Council, he would divert some of the profits from the selling of those weapons to Iran to the sale of weapons to the Contras in Nigeria. And this would be a violation of that Borland Amendment that we talked about that said, hey, funds and arms can't be sent to Nigeria or Nicaragua to help out the Contras there. Now, once this gets discovered, you're going to see Reagan would deny that he had knowledge of the diversion of funds. And now looking back, kind of evaluating in history, most people kind of agree that he probably did not have knowledge of it, that this seemed like something that was drawn up by his aides, and he did not have direct knowledge of that. Despite that, though, you're going to see on March 4th, 1987, Reagan would go on TV. He would take full responsibility for the affair and say what began as a strategic opening to Iran deteriorated in its implementation into trading arms for hostages. So again, this would be the biggest kind of scandal of his presidency. Actually, Oliver North would be convicted for his role in that. Kind of funny, later on, Oliver North would actually run for governor of Virginia when I was a kid. But through this, you're going to see that Reagan, throughout his presidency, he got the nickname Teflon Ron because of his ability to rebound from this Iran-Contra affair and then from other, minor things that happened throughout his presidency. A lot of people saw him as able to bounce back. And again, I think a lot of that was just due to the fact that he was a likable guy. Now, issues in the Middle East, again, these have been present for a while. You'd see in 1982, Israel would invade southern Lebanon to stop the PLO terrorists from raiding Israel. They had basically been operating in southern Lebanon and carrying out attacks in Israel. U.S. would send peacekeeping forces into Lebanon to help contain the civil war that was going on in that area. In April of 1983, you would have an Arab suicide squad bomb the U.S. embassy in Beirut, killing 63 people. And in October of that year, you would have Arab terrorists drive a truck bomb into U.S. Marine barracks, killing 241 servicemen. And by 1984, Reagan pulls the U.S. forces out of Lebanon. So again, not too successful with what we were trying to accomplish in Lebanon there. Now, as I mentioned, with the Soviet Union, Ronald Reagan did show a willingness to work with the Soviet Union. 1985, Mikhail Gorbachev, he would become the new Soviet leader. And you're going to see that he tries to implement a lot of changes within the Soviet Union. Because one, like I said, they were financially and economically very, very weak. And that's something that he tried to fix. So he would implement two new policies, one glasnost, which is openness, to try to end political repression and move towards greater political freedom for Soviet citizens, and perestroika, which is a restructuring of the Soviet economy to try to implement more free market economics practices into their economy. Now, Gorbachev also signaled a willingness to end the costly arms race with the U.S. To try to help, again, deal with the struggling economy within the Soviet Union. Now, once he indicated that, but then kind of backed down and wasn't willing to do anything, you're going to see Reagan issue a direct challenge to him while standing at the Brandenburg Gate of the Berlin Wall in Germany. Reagan would challenge him by saying, "Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall." Again, a lot of people saw this as Reagan being a strong leader, something that a lot of people view that Jimmy Carter had not been. So after that, you're going to see an actual reduction in tensions between the U.S. and the Soviet Union. In 87, you'd have the INF treaty signed to remove and destroy all intermediate range missiles. In 1988, you're going to see the Soviet Union begins to pull their troops out of Afghanistan. And the Soviets would cooperate with the U.S. in putting pressure on Iran and Iraq to end their war. The Soviets and Russia have always had a better relationship with Iran than we have. And again, they were able to do that and able to get end that civil war or the war between those two nations. Now, two people that you're going to see that worked very, very well together is a lady known as the Iron Lady over in Britain, Margaret Thatcher. She was the British Prime Minister during that time. And you're going to see that her and Ronald Reagan had a extremely good relationship with each other. Over in Great Britain, they were kind of going through a conservative revolution as well. And Margaret Thatcher was definitely a conservative during that time. You can see kind of how they match up here in their thoughts with these two quotes. Ronald Reagan saying socialism only works in two places, heaven where they don't need it and hell where they already have it. And Margaret Thatcher saying the problem with socialism is that you eventually run out of other people's money. So again, the two of these would kind of form a great bond and a great friendship, again, just strengthening that U.S. relationship with Great Britain. Now, one of the things with Ronald Reagan is he was known as the great communicator. Again, like I said, he was a likable guy. People enjoyed hearing him talk, enjoyed his humor and that kind of thing. And because of that combination of his style, humor, and patriotism, a lot of people did like him. And as a result, he would leave office as one of the most popular presidents of the 20th century, and he would really have a massive effect on politics for at least a generation. I would argue probably over the past 10 years, we've seen kind of a waning in some of the ideals of Reagan, but we really would have a huge effect. Again, another one of the things that really endeared people to Ronald Reagan is that he was known for telling jokes. I've included a video there that kind of has a compilation of some of the jokes that he would tell. He would often tell jokes at the expense of the Soviet Union, but I encourage you to kind of check those out. And when you do, you'll see how even though people disagreed with him politically, he was a likable person. So, what is the legacy of Ronald Reagan? Really, his judicial appointments. Again, those would have a huge effect over the next 20, 25, 30 years or so. His anti-government stance, I should say anti-big government, big federal government stance would have an effect on politics for the next 20 years. It would affect the presidencies of George H.W. Bush, Bill Clinton, George W. Bush. And Reaganomics would reduce restrictions on the free market economy and kind of contain the growth of some of that new deal welfare state that had been started during the 1930s. And again, when we are talking about the Reagan Revolution overall, that really it was this philosophy of reevaluating the size and scope of the U.S. government. So we talked about earlier some of the things that they advocated here, again, to be more specific. And these are some of the principles you're going to see carry on to other conservatives afterwards, like tax cuts, again, turning more responsibilities over to the state, appointment of justices that exercise judicial restraint, again, reducing the size and scope of government programs, and strengthening the American military. And when we're looking at his influence in the future, again, his vice president would be elected president. In 1994, after the election of Bill Clinton, you would see Republicans would sweep the congressional elections and state houses again as people started to look more, again, back to those policies of Reagan. And I would even say with Bill Clinton as president, you're going to see that Bill Clinton kind of takes on some more conservative principles during his presidency, such as doing things like tax cuts and welfare reform. 2001, George W. Bush would be elected. And then 2009, you'd have the Tea Party movement. Again, all of these taking some of these core Reagan principles and putting them into practice or advocating for those things. So again, we kind of spent a whole day on this conservative revolution and Reagan because he is going to have such an impact on future presidents, and this whole conservative revolution would do that. So hope you enjoyed listening to this. Sorry, it went a little bit longer. You're going to see with all these presidents and all of this era that things are a little bit more detailed just because so it kind of set up and so that we can understand history better today as we see it. So thank you for your attention, and I hope you have a great day.